Hamas didn't just up it one night and decide to raid Israeli cities and towns. There must have been some instigation, something behind it that led to this kind of escalation.
My question always is, what choice did Hamas have? Since 2006, they have been under siege. That's a long time. A siege is an act of war. Ben-Gurion said at that time, echoing the founder of Zionism, he said he will accept what the UN is giving, which is 53% of Palestine, to Israel.
Israel, yeah.
Accept it as a down payment on the rest of Palestine. Resistance that you have left among the Palestinians to stand up against such a huge power, backed by other colonial powers like France, Britain, and now the superpower, the US. Unfortunately, Canada is a part of it. And so we have just tiny resistance left. If Hamas were to surrender, there will be no Palestine.
This is Amina with Nayador. As the conflict between Israel and Palestine enters its 17th day, the devastation, the suffering, the misery, the loss of human life continues. If anything, the situation is more dire than ever. Is this the worst? Have we seen the worst, or is the worst still to come? To discuss this and more, I have with me today an expert on the subject. I have with me Professor Abdul Jabbar. Assalamu alaikum, Professor.
Wa alaikum salam, Amina. Thank you for having me on your program.
Of course, it's a pleasure to have you. So just a quick word about Professor Abdul Jabbar. He's a professor of English and interdisciplinary studies at College of San Francisco, and he's a former visiting professor of English at University of California, Berkeley. He's a recipient of a Fulbright scholarship and has received 2 national endowments for humanitarian awards. He received his PhD from Case Western University, Cleveland, Ohio, and he's authored 3 books and penned multiple articles on literature and politics. He has been teaching a course on Middle Eastern politics for the last 15 years with a special focus on Palestine and Gaza. So he's definitely an expert on the subject and is a person to talk to about what's happening today. As I mentioned, Dr. Abdul Jabbar, that the conflict is ongoing. There seems to be no end in sight. But before we delve into what the future holds, I just want to kind of get your input on what you think actually led to this attack. I mean, obviously, Hamas didn't just up it one night and decide to raid Israeli cities and towns. There must have been some instigation, something behind it that led to this kind of escalation.
Okay, so most of the people who want to support Israel in discussions with me, they say Hamas did the wrong thing by launching this terrorist attack. And so they condemn it, and that's why the misery is all over Gaza. I asked them, what choice did Hamas have? Now, fine, it's regrettable, it happened, it's tragic, the loss of lives is tragic, whether it is Israeli or Gazan. But my question always is, what choice did Hamas have? Since 2006, they have been under siege. That's a long time. A siege is an act of war by any definition. So it is not just unprovoked. The argument I dismiss completely. Now, going back to, I think it's really important to just contextualize and place this current situation in historical context. So I'll just do a very quick connection making here. So there are 3 years which are very important to understand what's going on in Gaza. First year is 1896.
Hmm.
The second year is 1917, Balfour Declaration. The first, 1896, is when the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, published his book called The Jewish State. Why is that important? Because it was his ideology that is being carried on by the Israeli Zionists, starting with the first head of state, David Ben-Gurion, to the current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. So what was the ideology? In his book, Herzl lays out the plan. He says that now this is long before the Holocaust, the very tragic loss of 6 million Jews in Europe in the Holocaust. That happened in Second World War. But I'm talking about 1896. Now, the language that he uses, Herzl, he says we will drive out the Palestinians from Palestine. First, gently persuade them to leave. And then if we have to use force, we will. Okay. Then if we go from there, in that book, he also uses the words, this state will be a European fortification or rampart against Oriental barbarism. I think the language is very important because the current Zionist leadership is using this kind of language. Subhuman, Palestinians are subhuman, that language. So the state itself is visualized as a European state in the Middle East and as a defense against barbarism. Now, I'm cutting it out and moving on to 1947. I mentioned
Right.
17, which is Balfour Declaration. I won't have time to go into that, but that is the basis of the state of Israel. What happened in 1947 is the UN partition plan.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1948, Israel was created as a state. Ben-Gurion said at that time, echoing the founder of Zionism, these are very important words, and I think most people don't know about this history. He said he will accept what the UN is giving, which is 53% of Palestine, to Israel.
Israel, yeah.
Accept it as a down payment on the rest of Palestine. He goes on to say, we, Israelis, will have a very strong army and we will dissolve the partition. Imagine that the UN and the respect that he has for the United Nations will dissolve the partition. Now there's no change. That policy has remained the same. And so what you see in Gaza today is the culmination of that plan. And this is the last resistance that you have left among the Palestinians to stand up against such a huge power, backed by other colonial powers like France, Britain, and now the superpower, the US. Unfortunately, Canada is a part of it. And so we have just a tiny resistance left. If Hamas were to surrender, there will be no Palestine. So this is the situation right now. And as you mentioned, close to 8,000 people have been killed, Palestinians have been killed. And we should know that 2,000 are children, over 2,000 are children.
Correct.
Now, and 1/3 of the homes destroyed. Now, this is a textbook definition of genocide. And I want to read to you, for your viewers also, I don't have time to read, I want to mention to you that the historians and Jewish scholars are calling it a textbook case of genocide, and they are calling on Israel to have not just ceasefire is the wrong word, to stop massacring Palestinians. So ceasefire is really actually at this time the wrong word, because it's only one side that is continuing.
Yeah, it's not like both sides have an option. So, but just for the sake of argument, my question is, what objective did Hamas have for the recent attack that they carried? They knew that they were instigating a might that was much more powerful than them, and the retaliation would have very dire consequences. So it seems like, from what you are saying, that they just kind of played into the hands of Israel and accelerated the process in doing so.
That's a very important question, and I ask that question to myself all the time. And when I discuss it with other scholars and colleagues, we talk about that. Now, my question, my answer is, what choice did Hamas have? Okay, they took this action. This is a very desperate action and almost sure that the might of Israel will crush them. So they killed, unfortunately, of course, there are over 1,200 Israelis.
And
now they have already, they've lost 6,000.
Exactly.
So this is not really something that they sat down, Hamas, and said, well, we have a choice. Now, Israel had a choice to exercise restraint in self-defense. And Hamas, the choice was simply to continue suffering under the siege. Now, the siege started in 2006. That was an act of war. There have been other assaults by Israel on Gaza, you know that, 3-4 times, 2012, 14, so on. But this is the most devastating. And I think Netanyahu has made it clear that he said it is going to reverberate in history. I don't want to get away from your question. Coming back to your question, why did Hamas do it knowing the mighty power will crush them? I think Chris Hedges gives a very good answer. I will quote his words. He said, the Hamas fighters who went into Israel to launch their attack, they knew that they will be killed. So they had a choice in choosing how to die, because they had no choice how to live. Their life had been made so miserable, and their families, children, facilities, that they chose a desperate act. When you have somebody cornered, they are so desperate, they are drawing the attention of the world to their continued state of existence. This is my perception of why they launched it.
Okay. So just taking off of this, like you said, the siege has been ongoing since 2006, 2007. So if Hamas had led status quo, or if it had maintained status quo, things would still be what they had been since 2006? Or do you think that the recent election of an extremely right-wing government had made things even worse for them, and it's a consequence of that?
It is very likely, because whenever there is an election, it's always speeding up of tensions and expectations, or sometimes based on who might be the next leader. If you remember, in his second bid for being elected, Netanyahu was trailing behind
Yeah.
the last election. I'm talking about his.
Yeah.
Then he made a statement that if he is re-elected, he will never allow the state of Palestine to come into being. And he was elected.
Yeah.
That was his platform. So I think Hamas knows pretty well what the consequences will be. Now, the president of Israel, I thought he was a better, more balanced individual. I think of Netanyahu as a cartoon character, sorry. And he is actually, in my view, to me, he is worse than Hitler. I don't want to go into that. But even the president of Israel has said, we make no distinction between civilians and Hamas fighters. Now, what kind of language is that? No difference. So go on killing everyone indiscriminately. That's what they're doing. So Hamas definitely had certain calculations in their mind, but the bottom line is that they wanted to draw the world's attention to that state. The status quo was no longer acceptable to them. And we should all know that resistance is allowed in international law against occupying forces. And Israel is an occupying force. Now, whenever I'm asked that question, if Hamas had not done that, the continuation of status quo was not acceptable. Nothing was being done. Why? Because the US has monopolized the peace process, and Hamas knows that the US is not going to change unless there's a lot of pressure. So Hamas is counting on us, American people, voters, to make our leadership responsible for what they're doing. I think the last straw that Hamas had was Israel's election of the ultra right-wing people, and they thought that was the end of their hope. As you mentioned, there is definitely connection between that. So this re-election of Netanyahu was the end of their hope.
So also, what about the hostage situation? Do you think that Hamas thinks that they have any leverage in determining the turn of events by holding on to those hostages or using them as a bargaining chip?
I think it was very good that the two hostages released with the help of Red Cross by Hamas. They said that they were treated very humanely.
Yeah.
Because they were not in good health. The Hamas leadership, they returned them. Now, if the Israeli government were more humane or concerned about humanitarian angles, they would appreciate it. But in this mood that you have this government, Israeli government, I don't think it will affect them. Hamas can be as gentle as they want. However, the international community is watching it, and I am noticing a little shift in some European leadership and awareness among the Middle Eastern and the Southern globe. It is a global struggle now. I think Palestine has become one of the four major global issues. Black Lives Matter, gender justice, and then one of the climate change, and this Palestine has risen to that level. So I think Hamas has succeeded in making an impact on people who have an open mind. Of course, Israeli state has a right to exist, but not at the cost of extermination of Palestinians. So this is most of the people feel that way about the world. Now, some European countries are now becoming aware that Hamas is not a monstrous organization. They're showing humanity in releasing this. Personally, I don't think it will have any effect directly on Israel, but can have an effect on the international community, and they can in turn try to mold Israel. My biggest disappointment at this time is with our own government here. And I hate to repeat the words, but I have to repeat the words of Martin Luther King when he said about Vietnam context. He said, the worst purveyor of violence in the world is this country of mine. These are the exact words of Dr. Martin Luther King. And let me also, while I'm talking about this, before I forget, the words of George Bernard Shaw also come to my mind. He said, the only country in the world that has gone, this is the way it starts, America is the only country in the world that has gone from barbarism to decadence without once passing through civilization. Just imagine that.
Interesting, yeah.
It's a very devastating point, and I always argued against him. When I discussed that, this came up, I said, no, he is actually, jealous of America's great achievements and all that. But our leaders, our countries, this country is wonderful. There are so many wonderful people here. A lot of the grassroots movements here are for justice. But our leadership, I think we have to blame ourselves. It's a democratic country, so we should take responsibility for electing people who run the show. Now, I will come to that later, that there are people, congressional leaders, who are wonderful people. Just Betty, I think at least there are maybe, I would say, 50 people who are now actively participating to have ceasefire. Betty McCollum is one of the leading people I will mention.
So, but when you bring this argument to a lot of people, what I've heard is that there have been talks that U.S. has actually been beseeching Israel not to conduct ground invasion unless the hostage situation is resolved. And in fact, they were the ones who convinced Israel to let aid get through, at least some aid get through to Gaza. And also, just I want to add another layer of question to this before you answer that, is that we keep talking about how European states and how US has not really been seeing the Palestinian point of view, have not really been advocating for them. But how about the Muslim bloc? How about them? I haven't seen any advocacy efforts from any of the Muslim states either, or any efforts to bring this point to the forefront.
I fully agree with you. That is really a very big disappointment. And I think the reasons are pretty obvious, that they are all trying to stay in the good books of the US. If they make too many waves, they will be punished. It's as simple as that. But it is unconscionable. The only countries that took a very active part in getting the trickle of humanitarian aid were Jordan, Egypt, and Qatar, maybe one more. But the powers like Saudi Arabia, who have the resources and have some leverage with the White House, they are not really doing their job. Most of the Emirates are not doing their job. Qatar is the only exception. They are actively participating. The EU sent some food, and but you're right. In politics, they are totally irrelevant. And Egypt refused to open. Now, Egypt was being pressured by the US, by Europe, to open the border.
Correct.
Okay. Now, what would that mean? That would mean the second Nakba, 1 million refugees in 1 week and going into Egypt. So Sisi took a stand. I don't like him, the way he came into power and killed the democratically elected leader, Mohammed Morsi. So I don't like him at all. But his position is, at this point, good. He's taking a stand, standing up to Israel, standing up to the pressure by the US to open the border. The plan that Israel has is to push these 1 million or more, the 2.3 million people in Gaza, push them out of Gaza into Sinai, Egyptian Sinai, the desert.
Right.
And so I would say that at least Egypt has taken some stand, and Jordan is helping in the humanitarian aid, but Jordan has no really political power. So
Yeah.
I agree with you that the Muslim bloc has played a very deplorably negative role in this whole struggle. And
Yeah, that's what I wanted to highlight, that we keep blaming US, we keep blaming European countries, but nobody ever talks about how Muslims are not doing anything. They're not even standing up behind and advocating for right of self-determination for Palestinians, which is a basic right for them.
I mean, I would like to slightly disagree about the emphasis. See, the Muslim countries have no power. The US has the power.
True.
To make changes. They can only plead, and they have been pleading for a long time. The Arab League made an offer. It was called Arab Peace Plan. Bush was the president. He said he liked the plan. It should be implemented. And Israel said no. What was the plan? It was recognition of Israel as its secure borders.
Mm-hmm.
It was created, even 1967 border. That would leave only 22% of historic Palestine for Palestine. Remember that. Now, this is 78% in Israel's occupation and 22%. Even that was rejected by Israel. That was the Arab League plan. So Arabs have done all these. Saudi Arabia had its own plan, was a wonderful plan. So the point is, the US, to me, US is the number one impediment to peace between the two countries. There's a question that always comes up when I'm teaching the subject. This is the most recurrent question students ask me. Why does the US do it? What is the motive behind it? Palestinians have a right. It was their state. They were about 93% when the Jewish agencies started to come in. Then when the state of Israel was created, they were given 53%, which is all more than expected. So why does the US have this policy? So my answer, very straightforward answer, which is also for your viewers, because I'm sure everyone is puzzled. My straightforward answer, Amina, is that the US wants to have the control of the Middle East for hegemonic reasons. All superpowers do it. US is not an exception. And US is using Israel as a base. Israel is primarily, at this point, it is a European state, a European bridgehead into the Arab world, into the heart of the Arab world. So I think the US has the power to do it. One interesting point that I think we should know is the Russian Federation's representative at the UN about a week ago.
Yes.
He said, we are having this situation in Gaza. I agree with him 100%. This delegate from Russia, he said, we are watching in Gaza what is the result of, number one, Israel's violation of UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, violation of those. And the second reason is that the US has monopolized the peace process, and it continues to use vetoes. It has used the veto for about 45 times on Israel to protect Israel's violations of international law. What kind of country is this in which I'm living? It is a civilized country. It is a UN Security Council resolutions that are being violated. On the one hand, my government says we are against settlements, the Jewish settlements in the occupied land. Nobody has ever said that we are in favor of that. But when it comes to enforcing that resolution, we veto it. What kind of hypocrites we are. I don't really think that we have sane foreign policy. Very, very plainly, our policy that we have, especially about Israel, is insane, suicidal. There was military leaders and civilian leaders who are sensible have made this statement. When he was chair of Joint Chiefs of Staff, David Petraeus, he later was also director of CIA.
Mm-hmm.
David Petraeus said, I'm quoting his words, Israel's intransigence endangers American lives at home and abroad. Now, this is a military top leader who is saying that. Again, I'll repeat it because this needs to be heard. And I tell it to my American friends that we are very blind. We invite problems instead of solving them. And these words again, David Petraeus saying, Israel's intransigence endangers American lives at home and abroad. Now, he made the statement in the context of the 9/11 attack. Of course, that was a terrorist attack. No justification for that, even if there were grievances and all that in the background, but no justification. But we have to protect ourselves. What Petraeus is saying is we should not have policies that make the people so mad
that you make your own population vulnerable.
That, and then Carter, he was president. He wrote a book, Palestine Peace, Not Apartheid. His words are also very similar to Petraeus's. He says peace will come to Israel, Palestine, only when Israel will honor international law. And he said, we Americans are squandering our goodwill, global goodwill, and inviting terrorism, global terrorism. Now, if you look up the word for word, these are the words of Jimmy Carter. So I've given you the words of a top leader, the military. There are American people who are sensible. Why do we bring into power people who have such policies that make no sense? That's my question to everyone here that I deal with. So the reason, again, finishing the answer, the reason I digressed a little bit, I said that you're right. The Muslim countries have played a very dismal role, and we blame the US. Let me say, re-emphasize, I will blame the US first. I'll blame the US second, blame the US third, and then I will go to anyone else to blame for the reasons I gave you. The US can stop this in 1 minute.
Mm.
$3 billion a year given to Israel and telling the world two-state solution is our policy. And we are such hypocrites at the government level. I love the Jewish Voice for Peace. Wonderful organization. I'm a member. They open it. And there are a lot of Jewish groups in this country who are doing a great job, much better than any Muslim country has done, in my view. So I think it is important to make this point, and since we're discussing that, many people confuse criticism of Israel as if it were an anti-Semitic act. I think this is very important. Many of my friends and colleagues have been victimized because they criticized Israel's policies and they were called anti-Semitic. The most famous examples are Norman Finkelstein, Stephen Silaita. He was a professor, University of Illinois, offered him a job. And when he tweeted that his family and friends in Gaza were being very brutally attacked, he tweeted that, and the University of Illinois withdrew the offer. Okay. Now, what I'm saying, the point that I think we all have to know is we have to bring in people who can represent America's best and not prove Bernard Shaw that we are a country that has gone from barbarism to decadence without once passing through civilization. So I don't want us to be a part of that barbarism.
Okay. The question, and I kind of alluded to it in the beginning of this conversation, was that we don't really see an end in sight. So do you think that the threat of a second Nakba or complete dispossession of Palestinians is a real threat as an end to this conflict?
It is a real possibility because the US is backing it. I was very shocked when I heard it is not just Israel, but Europe. When I say Europe, France, Britain, the US, and Canada a little bit behind them. These powers are pressuring Egypt to open up and then resettle these people in Sinai. Now, Egypt is standing up. I don't know. Egypt is having a huge economic crisis. I don't know how long Egypt will withstand that. I'm not sure. Egypt will give in. So there's a definite possibility of that. But Amina, on the other hand, there is hope. Noam Chomsky is one of the greatest intellectuals here, where he's just a Jewish American, greatest one. In terms of his views, he said, the only hope is the only change will come right here in America. He said it's difficult, but it is possible. So I agree. And who are the people who are carrying on this hope and who can prevent this second Nakba? So let me read to you the proposal that Betty McCollum, she is a congresswoman from Minnesota, she has introduced. She introduced that a few years ago, and it was a wonderful proposal. It didn't have much traction because AIPAC and the lobbies like that, they pressurized the other congressional leaders. I think that is a tragedy that our leaders don't trust us, the constituents. They trust these lobbies. So they follow the lobbies. So Betty McCollum introduced that a few years ago, and now she reintroduced that in May of this year. I want to read to you this as a hopeful sign. It is a HR 2590. You can look up this on Betty McCollum's website, whole bill. But I'll read to you just a few hopeful words that U.S. politicians are not all of the kind that Biden is. So Congresswoman Betty McCollum has introduced the Defending the Human Rights of Palestinian Children and Families Living Under Israeli Military Occupation Act to prohibit Israel from using US taxpayer dollars on the military detention, abuse, or ill treatment of Palestinian children in military detention. To support the seizure, we don't want our money to be used to support the seizure and destruction of Palestinian property and homes in violation of international humanitarian law, or on any support or assistance for Israel's unilateral annexation of Palestinian territory in violation of international humanitarian law. So there is an accountability office, and she goes on to say that all aid given to Israel should be subjected to the same scrutiny that we apply to others. So she goes on to say, millions of Palestinians have lived their entire lives under the systematic oppression of Israel's military occupation. Number two, Israel is a US ally, and the past 25 years, Congress has focused on providing Israel security funding while passing resolutions supporting a two-state solution. During this time, Israel has been strategically expanding settlements, committing flagrant violations of human rights against Palestinian children and families, and aggressively undermining any prospects for Palestinian state. US assistance intended for Israel's security should foster peace and must never be used to violate the human rights of children, demolish the homes of Palestinian families, or to permanently annex Palestinian lands. So there's a lot of more detail,
Right.
but go on the website, on Betty McCollin's website, and you'll find that. So this is a hopeful sign. There are about 50 congressional leaders, close to 50, who have signed on now. So this could take a momentum. And you probably know that in the State Department, 400 staffers, Jewish and Muslim, have sent a petition to the Congress that we appreciate your concern for the Israelis, but we see no word of concern about the Palestinians. So please have a heart for them too. So these are 400 staffers in the White House, Department of State I'm talking about. And then a very senior official, he resigned in protest against Biden's one-sided policy. So things are happening, grassroots movements are happening here. It will have some impact, but it is happening. It will take a long time. In the meantime, what will happen? We just hope that sanity prevails on the part of my government here. We can stop that Nakba, or what is going to happen. Nobody else can.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to end the conversation on a hopeful note, since you have pointed out a few rays of light, few avenues of sanity. So, and I would like to use this platform to appeal to powers to be, to use their better judgment and try to come to a conclusion that is peaceful for everyone, that would end this loss of life, human misery, human suffering, because the color of blood is the same everywhere. So we don't want either sides to suffer, but we do want the Palestinians to have their right of self-determination that they've been fighting for eons. And if there's anything else that you'd like to add, Professor, before we end this conversation.
I think that's a wonderful concluding message from you, and that is exactly what I would like to see, that both sides living in peace side by side. And this has been the goal of, according to Carter, 80% of Palestinians also want that. 20% will always be there who will not agree, but their disagreement doesn't really mean that much. Ultimately, when there are two contenders who cannot come to terms, a superpower like the US can bring them together and lead them to peace.
Thank you. Thank you much.
Thank you very much for having me on your program.
Of course. Thank you. I really appreciate your conversation and your comments.
Yeah, it was good to talk to you. I'm so happy to meet you, even though on TV on this show.
If you are here ever in this part of the country, please let me know.
Do a program in Punjabi, I can do that too.
Oh, okay. We do have an Urdu and Punjabi section, so maybe we could
I was
do
reading
that.
On Google your background, so it is probably you're also from Lahore, or
I am from Lahore.
I'm from Lahore also, so we can have a, but nobody will understand our Punjabi.
Not here, but back home, definitely.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. It
Thank
was
you.
we should stay in touch, and
Yes, absolutely. And once it's ready to be published, I'll share the link with you. So if you'd like to, share it with anyone, your students or anything, you're more than welcome to do that.
Of course. And I think it will be wonderful to, I will thank Fawzia for putting us in touch. It'll be wonderful to keep an eye on what's happening, and
definitely,
hopefully things will not be as bad as they are now.
As they are now, definitely.
Have a great day, and
thank you. This is hopefully would be our small effort in trying to at least make people aware of the reality of the situation and not just go by whatever media portrayal is, because there is no Palestinian side of the media.
In this media, in this country, really it is. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend highly this documentary, which is titled "The Occupation of the American Mind." And the American mind is now occupied not just West Bank and Gaza, but and it is Professor Sood Jhalli, Jhally. He is the producer. And I think it's just it's available free if you go through your university or through a public library.
I will do that. Yeah, we have public libraries all over.
Enlightening. And Jewish Israeli activist, journalist, Gideon Levy, he's one of my friends. He said that he wishes everyone would see this documentary, The Occupation of the American Mind. And one book, if you haven't read it, really very crucial is, you can recommend it to your audience, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine.
Okay.
It is by an Israeli Jewish professor of history. His name is Ilan, I-L-A-N, the last copy, P-A-P-P-E. Amazing. He had to flee from Israel after the book was published, and he's living in England, teaching there. Yeah.
I'll certainly look into both of these.
Of course, your knowledge, I don't have it. I admit the knowledge and the work you are doing as a criminologist, so you are an all-rounder. We can't compete you in badminton either. You probably are a much better player.
Looks like you've been really reading into whatever is on there about me.
These days, you can find a lot of
everyone. Yeah, you could probably, yes, everything about everyone.
Well, very good talking to you, Amina.
Nice talking to you too. Thank you again. Thank you much.